Now, finally, I'd like to turn to Whitman's role as an occasional correspondent for the district's newspapers. Recall that before Whitman was a poet, he was a journalist. At the tender age of 12, he had his first signed article published in the New York Mirror. Whitman later wrote, "How it made my heart double beat to see my piece on the pretty white paper in nice type." And if there are any authors here who had the same response when they were published, I think I did. Soon enough, Whitman was the lead editor of a succession of Brooklyn and Manhattan papers, including the New York Aurora, the Long Island Star, and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And for a short time, he even worked in New Orleans as editor of the Crescent. Although not a full-time occupation during his Washington years, journalism constituted an important outlet for the writer Whitman. During the Civil War, he was a bedside correspondent, as I mentioned, writing to the New York Times and the Brooklyn Eagle of his hospital visits. Following the war, Whitman contributed occasional squibs, as he called them, to the local Washington papers. Anybody recognize this figure? Bill Brown might. This is Crosby Stewart Noyes, who is a longtime editor of the Washington Evening Star. Among his publishers was Crosby Stewart Noyes, the owner-editor of the Star. Whitman also published in the Sunday Herald, the Sunday Morning Chronicle, and the Daily Morning Chronicle. Typically, Whitman's pieces were quick sketches of city life, written anonymously, but featuring Walt Whitman as the subject or central character. In the last few years, I've been lucky to find a half dozen previously uncollected pieces of Whitman's Washington journalism, and I thought I might sample two of them to show the topics the poet is engaged in. The first article is titled "Washington as a Central Winter Residence" and shows Whitman in the role of civic booster. Published in January 1872 in the Evening Star, it captures the emerging Gilded Age society. Whitman writes, "Americans are migratory and like change of scene. To those who can afford it, wherever they go in summer, flitting abroad, or to the uttermost parts of the land, it is getting to be generally agreed they cannot do better than rendezvous here for the winter." However, rather than touting the political and moneyed elite, Whitman promotes the artistic, cultural, scientific, and educational advantages of Washington, D.C. Quote, "The great Corcoran Art Gallery will form an art nucleus for the entire nation. The Congressional Library already is one of the first-class libraries of the world. The Smithsonian Institution, the Naval Observatory, Coast Survey, Hydrographic and Signal Offices, with other public departments, gather here a body of scientific men of the highest attainments, such as are found collected nowhere else in the country," end quote. I think we could agree with that today. Whitman notes that students from around the country flock to the city's three colleges, and he name checks Columbia, which today is George Washington University, Georgetown, and Howard University. They make good use of the numerous libraries, the scientific collections, the botanic gardens and conservatories, the government anatomical museum, the pleadings in the Supreme Court, and the debates in Congress. Whitman notes approvingly, "For the first time in the history of Washington, the city has streets sufficiently well paved to allow of a pleasure driving every day through the winter. And the brilliant spectacle on Pennsylvania Avenue of an afternoon is a foretaste of what the future will show when the wealth of the country shall congregate here, as it is beginning to do, for its winter Newport or Saratoga." I feel like we should have a shout out for Boss Shepherd at that point. Whitman concludes that the city, with its social, literary, political, musical, and scientific attributes, will vie with that of any capital in Europe. In the same issue, Whitman followed up with an article called "The Authors of Washington," in which he celebrates the city's emergence as a literary center. Writers in such diverse fields as law, medicine, astronomy, physics, political science, music, history, medicine, natural science, philology, philosophy, biography, journalism, literary criticism, engineering, fraternity, poetry, fiction, ethnography, and religion are all represented. The extensive enumeration reflects Whitman's broad view of literature, which he claimed in Democratic Vistas, quotes, "tills its crops in many fields." There we go. The article contained a detailed description of Eden Southworth. Anybody remember Eden Southworth? She was the most popular writer of that time period, and she wrote a wonderful book called The Hidden Hand. She lived in Georgetown. Also, journalist George Alfred Townsend, the fellow in the middle, he was the first to trace the escape route of John Wilkes Booth. Is that correct, Craig? Craig Howe's a great John Wilkes Booth escape route aficionado. But I think George Alfred Townsend was the first to do it for a popular magazine. And also Ben Perley Poor. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of his personal reminiscences, but it's still used by historians today to get a sense of the color of the district at the time. Unsurprisingly, the article notes the presence in the city of, quote, the poet Walt Whitman, a clerk in the Attorney General's office. His age is but 52, despite his venerable beard. For the president, it seems to be his fate to be neglected by publishers, insultingly slurred by critics and sundry official magnates in his own country, but welcomed with admiration and applause, both as person and poet, by the best authorities abroad, translated in Germany and Denmark, republished in England, and pronounced by the Westminster Review the first and only representative in art of American democracy. Well, Whitman had reason to crow that a British selection of Whitman's poems, published by William Michael Rossetti in 1868, introduced Walt's work to an appreciative audience that included Oscar Wilde, Bram Stoker, and Edward Dowden, who was a Trinity College Dublin professor who penned the laudatory Westminster Review cited by Whitman. Poet Ferdinand Freiligrath translated selected Whitman poems into German, while the Danish editor Rudolf Schmidt translated Democratic Vistas. Nevertheless, it is painfully obvious to Whitman that he could never fully remove the taint associated with his poetry in his own country, and his popularity would never equal his notoriety. Today, we might think it a bit curious or even underhanded for a writer to include himself as a subject within his own unsigned journalistic sketches. One reason Whitman did so was mercenary, of course. Whitman was acting as his own press agent. William Roscoe Thayer, the poet's friend, astutely observed, "We must remember that Whitman was a contemporary of P.T. Barnum, and he agreed with the master showman's views of publicity. So Whitman chose a style both in prose and verse, which at once arrested attention. He did not blush to write for the newspapers puffs of himself and his works. He craved notoriety, even of the flimsiest sort. The public," Whitman said to me, "is a thick-skinned beast, and you have to keep whacking away at its hide to let it know you're there." But looking at it another way, a third-person reference to himself was also Whitman's unique way of signing his work. If you recall, the first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855 didn't list the author on the title or cover page. We only learned his identity when midway through the signature poem called Song to Myself, the character calling himself Walt Whitman, a cosmos, appears.